Good evening, everyone. I'm Allison Robinson, Mellon Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow in Women's History and Public History. I'm excited to have you all join me for a discussion on the exhibition, Crafting Freedom, the Life and Legacy of Free Black Potter, Thomas W. Commeraw. Before we begin tonight's program, I would like to thank our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other generous donors. I would also like to give a very special thanks to First Republic for sponsoring tonight's program and for joining us. Your support allows New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission. Before we launch into the program, I want to let you know that it will last approximately 45 minutes, including 10 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. We have disabled the chat function, so please do make sure to use Q&A. After the presentation, we will get to as many questions as time allows. So with that in mind, let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about a story of a skilled Black craftsman and entrepreneur whose story was lost to history. This show will be the largest amassment of his works to date. There are more than 20 Commeraw jars featured in the Schaffler Gallery, and this is also the first show to trace his entire biography. We're using this gathering of objects and documents to highlight the importance of Thomas Commeraw to the history of American decorative arts, New York City, and Black life. The exterior of the gallery features photographs of his pots and an introductory video. Next slide, please. The show opens with this jar, which displays all of his signature motifs. If you look closely, you can see that it's made out of a stoneware clay. It has a salt glaze that gives it a bit of an orange peel texture to it. Wrapped all the way around the neck of the jar are several signature motifs that Commeraw would use throughout his career. This includes the name of his business, Commeraw's Stoneware, his location, Corlier's Hook, which we'll learn later was in the Lower East Side. It says N York, so you can identify where in the country he is, as well as these lunette shapes that we call swags, paired with tassels. What's so fun about this is that these swags and tassels actually come from high style design following the American Revolution. So he's drawing on inspiration from the pieces of furniture and the architecture that he's seeing around him to create the signature style. And of course, because it's made out of stoneware, he's infilled it with this beautiful cobalt blue that was popular in this particular industry. Next slide, please. We turn to the west wall of the gallery to start exploring Commeraw's biography. We begin with his childhood and we expand into the early years of his business. Next slide, please. One of the exciting things about this show is that it offers a glimpse into the historian's challenge of piecing together someone's biography. Brant Zipp discovered in 2003 that Thomas Commeraw was a Black craftsman. He realized looking at the 1800 census that he was actually listed as Thomas Commeraw, a Black. Now, this was earth-shattering for the decorative arts and the historical world because scholars had long assumed that Commeraw was a white craftsman. So to learn that he might be the only known Black stoneware entrepreneur in New York City in this time was a huge revelation. Later research would further uncover that Commeraw actually was formerly enslaved. He gained his freedom as a boy in 1779, around the age of 8 years old, from William Crolius, a stoneware potter who had enslaved Commeraw along with his parents and his two sisters. Next slide, please. The next little piece that we featured in our biographical section is Thomas Commeraw's marriage to his first wife, Mary Rowe. They wed in 1792 at Trinity Episcopal Church. And this is a particularly special moment because it is one of the few moments that she shows up in historical record. Their marriage and her death ultimately are the two pieces where we get insight into Mary Commeraw's life. And it also sheds light on a challenge of African-American women's history in this period, that it can be hard to track down the various documentary pieces. Next slide, please. Focusing on his business, we expand this story to look into the ins and outs of all the different forms that Commeraw is creating and kind of the motivations behind it. So we know that by 1795, Commeraw is making pots in an area in Lower Manhattan called Pot Baker's Hill. Now, this is the epicenter of the stoneware industry in New York, and it is also the space where the Crolius family, a multi-generational stoneware business started by William Crolius, would have operated. We're not sure where he received his education or his training in stoneware, but within 2 years, by 1797, he's actually started his own business in Corlier's Hook in the Lower East Side. Even more remarkable, by 1799, he's actually being taxed on his business and his home, a remarkable feat for anyone in the 1800s, particularly someone of African descent. Next slide, please. We're zooming in on this jar that we've placed right near the front of the gallery to really delve into some of the motifs that Commeraw is using to market his business. This jar comes from the New York Historical Society collection, and it features all the different aspects that I just previously described. So I mentioned the swags and tassels that he's borrowing from high style design. Well, here he's inverted them to form a shape that we call either a bow knot or a clamshell, given its delightful form. He's infilled the lunettes with cobalt and the tassels with manganese, so it comes into a bit of a purple color. We see the name of his business, Commeraw Stoneware, put triumphantly on the front of his jar, proclaiming that this was a product of his business. And of note, the S in Commeraw's as well as the N in stoneware are both backwards. We don't know how this happened, but we do know that it ends up becoming a trademark throughout the nearly 20-year span of his business. Similarly, I mentioned that he puts Corlier's Hook, the precise neighborhood where he's located, on his business. This would allow customers to know precisely where to find him to return to buy more wares. And a particularly fun aspect is that New York is upside down on this piece. We don't know why that's the case. It's part of the fun curiosity of the historian's work, but it raises a lot of questions, both about the speed with which stoneware would need to be produced. Did the person who was charged with stamping the wares accidentally do New York upside down? We don't know, but it does make this particular jar even more special to look at. Next slide, please. Commeraw, produced a range of forms throughout his career, and one that is particularly special are these jars. They were produced for Black oystermen active in New York City in the oyster trade. Now, this was a trade that was dominated by Black men who would harvest and pickle oysters that they found in abundance in New York City rivers. Now, if you look closely at these, you might notice that Commeraw used the same branding techniques for these jars as he did for his own business. You see the name of the oysterman on the top, their location with the precise street where to find them, and of course, that trademark New York stamp. The one on the right, you can clearly see says N.York with that dot precisely in the middle of the N and the Y. This is part of what helps us attribute this jar to Thomas Commeraw. Of particular importance is we see that Commeraw is using his entrepreneurial skill to support other Black businessmen. He's taking the same marketing techniques that he's using to support himself to support the larger entrepreneurial community of which he is a part. Next slide, please. This painting is so fascinating because it features the Lower East Side in the late 1790s. Now, this painting might be more rural than you would expect. If you look closely in the center of the painting, you'll see a series of masts on your screen, ship masts. This is roughly where Corlier's Hook would have been. It raises a lot of questions about what opportunities Commeraw might have thought awaited for him far from the epicenter of the stoneware business. It is far away from most of his competitors, but as you can see, it's also closer to ports than being right in the center of Lower Manhattan. So it makes you wonder what might have this entrepreneur, husband, and family man imagined for his family in this other part of New York City. Next slide, please. Below this painting of the Lower East Side, our exhibition includes a digital map that displays sites and events that were all important to Commeraw's life. It uses an image of a 1797 map, which you see here on the right, that comes from our collection at the New York Historical Society. Sites that we've added here range from his work at Pot Baker's Hill and founding his pottery on the Lower East Side to his political work all across the city. And if you have an opportunity to come see this exhibition live, we encourage you to explore Commeraw's New York here with our map. Next slide, please. The center of the gallery has this beautiful large wall that displays a range of decorative motifs used by Commeraw over the course of his career. Much like his pottery, you can see the top of it boldly declares Commeraw's stoneware, and the back pattern actually features those same decorative motifs, including this beautiful floral design, which I'm about to describe to you. Next slide, please. Early in his career, Commeraw is drawing on the Germanic patterns that are used within the tradition of stoneware to decorate his vessels. Here we see that he's made a floral incised design. This is extremely labor intensive. It requires a sharp tool to, by hand, create this design over and over again. And as with his later pots, he's infilled this with a cobalt blue prior to firing. If you look closely at the top, you can see that it reads Corlier's hook, but unlike some of the later jars that we discussed previously in this presentation, it has an extra E between the O and the R. This helps us date it to between 1797 and 1800 when he starts marketing his business. Of note, this piece is also lighter in gray because of its composition of the sand and the pieces, the materials used to make it, but also the proximity to the flame and the heat of the kiln when it was being fired. Next slide, please. By stamping and incising to decorate his vessels, Commeraw is starting to shift in the technique that he's using to decorate. We see with this piece, rather than a hand-incised floral design, instead, he's using these lunette shapes that we discussed earlier to decorate the rim of the vessel. These are the swags and tassels that we discussed that were infilled with cobalt blue. But if you look closely above the word cobalt, over the word Corlier's hook, you'll see that there's actually a really creative solution happening here. There's not quite enough space for another lunette or another swag. So instead, we see that someone has actually filled the space with two tassels. Again, we also have Corlier's hook with an extra E, which allows us to date it to earlier in his career. Next slide, please. Around 1800, we're seeing these swags and tassels. They're beautiful, they're commanding along the rim of the jar. They're proclaiming this as part of Commeraw's stoneware, his signature design. But of course, we have a new design that firmly makes this one of Commeraw's own. Around 1800, Commeraw starts to use the phrase Commeraw's stoneware on his vessels. And this design is really noticeable. Earlier, I mentioned the backwards S in Commeraw's and the backwards N in stoneware. But if you look closely, the crossbar in the A also has a unique bend to it. Why these details were included are a mystery, but they really help draw you into the jar and make this otherwise utilitarian vessel really beautiful and eye-catching. Next slide, please. Now, around 1800, Commeraw starts dropping the extra E in Corlier's hook. And as you can see on this jar, it's missing. This piece from the New York Historical Society is actually one of our favorites because it has this beautiful cylindrical form. It has this beautiful bright gray color, and you can see those really striking swags and tassels wrapping around the top of it. Next slide, please. Commeraw also experimented with other design motifs over the course of his career. On the right, if you look closely, we see little half net forms that are actually made using a compass. There's a small pin prick in the top center where the pin of the compass would have gone to create that lunette shape. And as is the case with all of his other forms, it is infilled with this cobalt blue. We see on the left that the mass production and speed necessary to make enough vessels to make stoneware a profitable business also led to some examples where the cobalt was applied a little bit less precisely than in other examples. And so we're getting a real sense of what it must have been like on the ground in this high-speed business. Next slide, please. We have a special corner of the exhibition dedicated to the process of making stoneware, and we've called this From Clay to Crock. It's tracing the production process from the component parts of stoneware clay all the way to throwing it on the wheel, decorating it, as we've just discussed, and firing it in the kiln. We've also mentioned on this north wall of the gallery that Commeraw would have been the only known African-American stoneware maker of his time. All of his competitors were white, and this is a space to understand both how Commeraw made himself distinct through decorative motifs, but also to give a sense of the different opportunities that one had when they were an African-American entrepreneur in 1800s New York versus one of European descent. Next slide, please. The Potter Shop displays 5 Commeraw works on the left-hand side, and this slide displays 2 from the New York Historical Society on either side, and this incredibly rare picture from the Winterthur Museum in the center. Next slide, please. Other competitors active in the stoneware business that we mentioned in this show include David Morgan. David Morgan and Commeraw certainly knew each other. They worked at Baker's Hill around the same time. I mentioned that Commeraw moved to Corlier's Hook in 1799. Well, so did David Morgan. He moved to Corlier's Hook as a boarder. Morgan probably also shared Commeraw's kiln. They both would have needed to produce stoneware in large quantities in order to stay afloat as entrepreneurs. And so it would make sense to collaborate in this way. And also, if you look closely, there are similar decorative motifs that they're both using. Here, David Morgan has arranged the swags again into a clamshell or a bow-knot shape and has put tassels on either side, but they're a slightly different design from Commeraw's. Similar to Commeraw, he's also infilled these shapes with cobalt and also decorated the handles of his pots with cobalt as well. And so while one craftsman was white and the other was black, we do see at least one example of these two men working together in terms of sharing a kiln. Next slide, please. Other examples of Commeraw's competitors include the Crolius family. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that William Crolius enslaved and freed Commeraw's family upon his death in 1779. Well, the Crolius family was a multi-generational stoneware operation. They were probably Commeraw's chief competitors, and we know, because of Commeraw's example, that they were enslavers and they used enslaved labor in the stoneware business. We can see as well that they used, or rather they produced a range of forms with stoneware clay. We just saw an example of Commeraw's stoneware, his pitcher production. Well, the Crolius family also produced pitchers. So we've included this incredibly exuberantly decorated and delightful spouted pitcher from the New York Historical Society collection, as well as this rarer inkwell. It is likely that Commeraw would have produced a similar range of forms. Next slide. And on that note, we know that Clarkson Crolius Sr., William Crolius's son, was born around the same time as Thomas Commeraw. In 1773, Clarkson Crolius Sr. was born to Commeraw's circa 1771 birth date. Clarkson Crolius Sr. was an active stoneware producer, but he and Commeraw ended up having very different trajectories, both in their lives and in the stoneware business as well. Clarkson Crolius Sr. in the 1820s would actually give the stoneware business to his son, Clarkson Crolius Jr., so he could pursue politics and his role as a statesman in the state assembly. Commeraw, meanwhile, as an African-American man, would not have had this opportunity available to him. And so we see two very different paths happening in the stoneware industry and among stoneware entrepreneurs, where on one hand, Commeraw would end up, as I will later discuss, falling into debt and traveling abroad to seek opportunity elsewhere. Meanwhile, Clarkson Crolius Sr. would become a prominent politician. And so there are very different political and economic possibilities and realities that are being shaped by race in 1800s New York. Next slide, please. With this context in mind about Commeraw's business and competitors, we're going to return to Commeraw's biography. You might note the location in the gallery is actually down the wall from our earlier discussion about his childhood and his business. But now we're going to shift the conversation to focus more on his political work in the free Black community. Next slide, please. We are so thrilled to feature this document in the show. It is the only confirmed document with Thomas Commeraw's signature on it, and it comes from the New York Historical Library. The 1800s were a period of opportunity for African Americans, as well as growing oppression. A series of state laws in New York, starting in 1799, began to offer legal avenues for enslaved Black people to start claiming their freedom. Commeraw gained his freedom nearly 20 years earlier, so this law did not impact him legally. However, increased avenues for freedom did not necessarily mean greater equality for African Americans in New York City. The New York State legislature at this time was also passing laws that made it harder for free Black people to vote. There are also a growing influx of European immigrants coming into the state, meaning more competition for housing, jobs, and even the right to vote. This paper here really encapsulates some of the different opportunities that are available depending on whether you are a free man of African descent or of European descent. Note, in this period, women did not yet have the vote, so this paper, which is called a Certificate of Freedom, is particular to free Black men. Free Black men had to file this form to prove that they were free citizens rather than enslaved people to vote. They would also have to pay a filing fee and later would have to prove that they owned property. Men of European descent did not have to do any of these three things in order to vote. This is particularly important for Commeraw because we can see here that Commeraw is marshaling his literacy, his ownership of his business, and his prominence as a businessman in the free Black community to support another young man's application to vote. This certificate of freedom was filed by 21-year-old Peter Johnson. Next slide, please. Commeraw worked on a number of political debates of his era, one of which was also slavery. Slavery was a subject that had a continued presence in Commeraw's life and political work. In 1808, the United States ended its participation in the international slave trade. Anti-slavery activists herald this as a harbinger of the end of slavery in the country. We know today that it would take almost another 60 years for that to happen. However, on the 1-year anniversary of that law's enactment, we see the free Black community gathering in a location called Zion Church, which is a Black Methodist church that was founded just a handful of years earlier. We learn from this document, which I've circled, that Thomas Commeraw actually participated in the celebration 4 separate times. He led 2 hymns and sang 2 hymns. So we can see that his creativity is being expressed not only in his professional life, where he's using high style designs rather than these more floral approaches to stoneware, but also that he's musically talented and using them in a celebration important to the free Black community. Next slide, please. On the wall above this pamphlet, we've hung a portrait of Peter Williams Sr., who was one of the founders of Zion Church. His son, Peter Williams Jr., was also a colleague of Thomas Commeraw. Next slide, please. Commeraw was a man who, you may have guessed by now, placed himself and his political work in the public eye throughout the 1810s. In addition to singing at the celebration and signing the Certificate of Freedom, he also published several newspaper announcements, issuing various calls to the free Black community related to political issues of the day. This one that I've seen here is related to the War of 1812. Now, Commeraw in 1814 is the chairman of an effort publishing a call asking the free Black community to help build a rampart to hold back a British invasion in Brooklyn. Ultimately, this was so successful that 850 Black men would respond to this call. We've paired it with a broadside from our collection, which is actually a song called Patriotic Diggers that was celebrating this interracial cooperation and cooperation across trades to successfully hold back the British. Next slide, please. As we swing to the other side of the gallery, we take a brief moment in the show to discuss the practical uses of stoneware. These works are beautifully decorated and such a delight to behold, but it's also kind of fun to remember that these objects are the Tupperware, the can, the mason jar of the 1800s. They're being used to store salted meats and foods, grains, jellies and jams, alcohol, and other foods of this nature. We have created this corner to explore both the range of Commeraw's reach as a business, but also to talk about the uses. So we've included this recipe, again, coming from our collection, for quince preserve. It's a food akin to marmalade. What's particularly special about this recipe is not only does it come from a woman's diary in the early 1800s, or 1820s, 1830s, it also specifies at the end that it needs to be stored in a stone pot for use. So we're getting a really good idea of how stoneware is being used in the home. We've paired this recipe with 2 archaeological shards that you see on the left here, which were uncovered in a dig of 2 locations in New York City. The left comes from Long Island and the right comes from Lower Manhattan. Commeraw's reach, we've learned, was actually global. His shards have been found as nearby as this city and as far away as Europe and South America. Next slide, please. As we continue to move around the gallery, we're starting to explore some of the growing tensions in New York City. I just mentioned the War of 1812, and it's of note that many New Yorkers suffered financially during and after this war. African Americans faced added political obstacles, which compounded their oppression. A growing question begins to emerge in free Black communities in cities like New York and Philadelphia. Should free African Americans stay in the United States and fight for their rights, or should they leave and seek opportunity elsewhere? Next slide, please. And so the first section of this wall explores the creative, entrepreneurial, and political lives of those who decided to stay and continue to build their community. Next slide, please. The African Free School was founded in 1787, 1788, but it was really established and held classes by 1794, at which point Commeraw was a teenager. He likely would not have, he was actually in his 20s, would likely not have attended, and we know that he was working in Pop Baker's Hill by 1795. But still, we knew it was important to include these pieces of schoolwork because we're seeing how a lot of the skills that entrepreneurs such as Commeraw were using on a day-to-day basis are actually being taught to free Black children in New York City. These two examples here that come from our collection show that the children are learning complex math equations, including calculating interest, which would have been necessary for operating a business or even considering investment. Next slide, please. Following the War of 1812, we're also seeing examples of African American entrepreneurship continuing to grow. We continue this theme of African Americans in the oyster trade along this wall because it was a wonderful opportunity to feature an oyster jar by Thomas Downing from our collection. Downing was a Black restaurateur who owned and operated a Manhattan oyster house starting in 1825. His upscale establishment helped make pickled and fried oysters a trendy food popular with the elite. Within 10 years, he expanded his business to include catering and started shipping oysters worldwide. Downing was also an abolitionist who was active in the Underground Railroad. We also, in this section, talk about the artistic community in New York City. Here on the right, we have a watercolor of James Hewlett portraying Richard III as part of New York's African Grove Theater in 1821. This was an all-Black troupe that performed Shakespearean plays for an all-Black audience. It was founded by William Alexander Brown, a free Black actor from the West Indies. And of note, James Hewlett also helped co-found the organization. Next slide, please. This was also a really great chance to feature this historically significant piece from our library. Now, the first Black-owned and operated newspaper in the United States was called Freedom's Journal, and it was started right here in New York in 1827. Samuel Cornish and John Russwurm were the editors, and they printed articles advocating for Black political rights and calling out racial discrimination. We have a copy of their very first issue, again, drawn here from our library, on display in the gallery. Next slide, please. Commeraw, unlike his contemporaries, did not decide to stay in New York in the 1820s. Instead, he and his family left the country to start over again through the American Colonization Society. And so as we proceed down the wall, the conversation shifts from free African Americans who stayed in New York to the early debates over colonization. Paul Cuffey was the son of a Wampanoag mother and an African-born free Black father, and he helped pave the way for immigrants like Commeraw. Seen here, Cuffey brought an earlier group of Black American settlers to the British colony of Sierra Leone in 1816. Cuffey's efforts were later taken up by the newly formed American Colonization Society, an organization that sought to remove free Black people from the United States and bringing them to Africa rather than bringing them fully into the political fabric of the United States. Cuffey would eventually withdraw his support from the project after it became clear that it was being sponsored by prominent Southern slave owners and was largely opposed by his fellow Black Americans. Next slide, please. Commeraw, meanwhile, was among those who sought a new beginning elsewhere and actually would travel with the American Colonization Society. Like many New York business owners, he faced a lot of financial difficulties due to the economic upheavals caused by the War of 1812. Beginning in 1812, he losing a series of lawsuits for non-payment of promissory notes. They're kind of like IOUs in an era where coinage is less standardized. And so he ultimately decides to mortgage his property by 1819. Of note, at this point, his first wife, Mary, has passed away from dysentery, and he's remarried another woman named Anne. Anne was actually listed on the newspaper announcement reporting the auction, indicating that she was considered an owner of the property as well. This would appear to be a really strong push factor to their decision, because after all, the Commeraws have defaulted on their loans and the sheriff is auctioning off their house and property. Seen here, however, is a letter penned by their pastor at St. Stephen's Church. This letter argues that Commeraw's motivations to leave were actually in support of greatness in Africa. So we've put the original auction advertisement and paired it with this letter on the wall to highlight the push-pull tensions that Commeraw was struggling with in 1819. Next slide, please. Our show concludes by exploring what started out as a hopeful journey to try to find a better life and would end up becoming rather tragic when the Commeraw family traveled to Sierra Leone. Next slide, please. In 1820, Commeraw, his wife Anne, their 3 children, many of Anne's extended family, and approximately 80 Black settlers emigrated on the first American Colonization Society voyage to Sierra Leone. We have a reproduction of the roll of immigrants from the ship Elizabeth on which they sailed, seen here and on the wall. The voyagers listed, you can see them starting on the bottom of the first page, include Commeraw, his second wife Anne, and their 3 children. Also, if you look closely, you'll see that Commeraw's name is misspelled, which adds to the difficulty of the historian's job that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, because his name is misspelled at least a dozen ways over the course of his life, adding to the challenge of trying to piece together this life of a man who's active in so many different places. Next slide, please. In the gallery, we've used this map of Sierra Leone to illustrate the experience that the Commeraws had while they were immigrants to Sherboro Island, which is where they landed. We've also superimposed 2 articles that Commeraw published about his experience on top of it. When Commeraw and his fellow immigrants first arrived, they'd hoped to found a new Black republic. Instead, they experienced unimaginable hardship and tragedy. What began as a venture for political rights ended as a struggle for survival. Commeraw's wife, Anne, and his niece would both contract malaria and would ultimately die after arriving on Sherboro Island. Commeraw, in his first article, was incredibly optimistic about the opportunities that this new voyage and this new space might hold for him and his family. But within a year, in 1821, he's sending yet another letter back to the United States, essentially pleading for help to get him, his sons, and his daughters out. They ultimately returned in 1822, but again, this was after Anne and their niece had already passed away. Next slide, please. The exhibition doesn't end where Commeraw's life did. He and his children returned to Baltimore landed in Baltimore in 1822, and Commeraw would pass away a year later in 1823. There's no indication that he ever returned to the potter's wheel professionally. But here we are, we're celebrating the life, political work, entrepreneurial skill, and decorative touches of this really incredible stoneware potter. And so it felt only fitting to keep pushing the conversation forward and look at Commeraw's personal and professional legacy as well. Here we see a watercolor of the jar that I highlighted earlier as one of the curator's favorites from the New York Historical Collection. And this jar was actually featured in something called the Index of American Design. Now, this was one of 18,000 watercolors produced during the Great Depression. The federal government started a program to put out-of-work artists back to work by recording and creating a compendium of all sorts of objects from across the country that captured the creativity and ingenuity of American art starting in the colonial era. Of note, Commeraw was included, and not only was he included once, his work shows up at least a dozen times in the Index of American Design. We are so pleased that actually more than one of our jars, but that this was one of the New York Historical Society jars that was included in this compendium. And it only shows you how even in the 1930s and 40s, it was recognized that Commeraw was a core part of the American decorative arts tradition. It is of note, however, that there's no evidence they knew he was a free Black man. And so his story, it continues to evolve and surprise us as time goes on. Next slide, please. My co-curators and I also had the just delightful opportunity to interview one of Commeraw's descendants for the show. We were so excited to share Commeraw's life and achievements and legacy with his family. We learned through genealogical research and interviews that Commeraw's descendants carried on a lot of his practices and traditions that he did over the course of his lifetime. He had a granddaughter who started her own ladies' hair emporium during the Civil War in Massachusetts. And here we see a descendant, Richard Henry Cook, actually received his master's degree and became an educator. Like Commeraw, he became politically active, and Cook was actually a community leader who called for an end to segregation in 1940s Florida. Next slide, please. We are so thrilled, similarly, to feature a trio of pieces by Queens-based ceramic artist Sana Musasama. She drew inspiration for Commeraw's story, including his transatlantic journey, to create her pieces entitled Passage. We placed her work at the base of the staircase in Smith, hoping that this will tempt visitors such as us to gather today to come up the stairs and view this exhibition. So thank you so much, everyone. That concludes my presentation, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. So my first question is, why might the Commeraws have settled in Baltimore as opposed to New York City upon returning to the United States? This is a really great question, and it's one that we don't have a clear-cut answer for, but there's a lot of possibilities that we can look into. One, that might have been the ship that was available to get them out of Sierra Leone back to the United States. Two, it's possible that Commeraw did not want to return to New York City, given the fact that he experienced so much political oppression there, he lost his business, and there's no evidence that he became a potter again. So it's possible that just as he and his family traveled to Sherborough Island, maybe they hope to find a new life in Baltimore as well. Of note, though, at least one of his sons did, in fact, return to New York after the death of his father and became a porter in the city. The next question that I have here is, how is it that Nodelman collected so many Commeraw pieces? Well, we are so fortunate that the Nodelmans developed this incredibly rich knowledge and love of American ceramics early in the 1900s. And so they're collecting a huge range of pieces of Commeraw and his competitors. They actually operated their own museum for a period, and that collection formed the foundation of our Commeraw collection at New York Historical. And it's possible that the Nodelmans, having developed an incredible eye, recognized that Commeraw's pieces, they're distinct in terms of design, but also fit the larger trend in terms of form and coloring. And so Commeraw was understood as important even in the early 1900s. Do I have any knowledge on why they mostly or only used cobalt? that is part of the stoneware tradition. And so we saw, for instance, that they are using other colors, like manganese made the kind of purple tassels, but cobalt is really the dominant color being used to decorate stoneware pots in this period. And so it's kind of like a larger visual language in this business, that you have the salt glaze that gives the pots really like an orange peel texture when you look closely at it, and a really beautiful rich blue color that just pops off of that gray and brown coloring of the clay after firing. So the next question, can I tell more detail about Sana Musasama's pieces and the way they're responding to Commeraw? I can give a little bit of insight. I would encourage everyone to come to the museum. There is an interview with Sana where she's talking all about the connection that she felt to Commeraw and really going into depth in a way that is really best heard through her voice. But I do think it's of note that in her pieces, she is tapping into that blue color. We talked about why are they using cobalt blue. Sana Musasama's work is drawing on those same earth tones, but with both a modern spin, but one that's also inspired by the fact that they share this transatlantic journey between the United States and West Africa. And so she's borrowing inspiration from Commeraw, inspiration from West African tradition, and bringing them together in such a beautiful and striking series of forms. The next question is, were there any other well-known free Black artisan contemporaries of Commeraw? Yes, so Commeraw is part of a larger network of religious figures, politically engaged individuals, and artisans. He's the only known artisan in the stoneware industry, but we do know that there are others, for instance, involved in furniture production and carpentry that are using their skills in trade to produce other really beautiful works. And so Commeraw is by no means standalone in terms of artisans working in this period. He's just the one that we've chosen to feature for this particular show. So unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you all so much for your participation and for your exceptional support of the New York Historical Society. Our next Curator Confidential will take place on Monday, March 20th for our exhibition, Kara Walker, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War Annotated. So please keep a lookout for an invitation. We hope that you can come see Crafting Freedom soon. The New York Historical Society is open Tuesday through Sunday, so reserve your timed entry tickets on our website. Thank you so much and have a lovely evening.